Chapter 16. Amelia sat in a winged armchair, hugging her knees to her chest and resting her chin on top of them. Although it wasn't cold out, she'd pulled the chair close to the fire for warmth. She was garbed only in a sheer silk robe, a wedding gift from Fenton. Her mind was too preoccupied to care that her robe, in its present location, covered very little skin. The fire's glow, even in broad daylight, was mesmerizing and drew her gaze into its dancing flames. Fenton had been standing in the doorway, watching her for several minutes, and he was very interested in knowing what she was thinking. He'd risen at sunrise and left her in bed resting while he went down to breakfast. Slowly, so as not to interrupt her reverie, he approached her. Her face flashed upward at the sound of a creak in the floor.
"Good morning, my love."
Fenton gave her the glass of orange juice he'd brought for her. "Thank you, Fenton. Good morning." She received the drink and took a sip.
"How did you sleep?"
he inquired, admiring the way the robe had slipped seductively down her arm. She followed the path of his eyes and grinned impishly. Standing up, she let the silken robe slip from her shoulders and drift to the floor. She'd never been a prude, and Fenton always appreciated her risque femininity. "Was last night insufficient to placate your appetite, my dear?" she asked, as silkily as the robe that encircled her feet. He placed his hands on her shoulders and massaged gently, drew her close, relishing her fragrance, and kissed her.
"When it comes to you, my sweet, I don't think my appetite could ever be placated,"
he replied, and scooped the robe off the floor, delicately replacing it around her shoulders.
"I don't want you to catch a chill. You looked so contemplative just now. What were you thinking about?"
She turned from him, en route to the window, took a long drink of orange juice, and placed the glass on the extended sill. "Oh, I was thinking about how we met."
His eyebrows rose. "I suppose the proximity of Paxton has brought on these memories?"
She glanced at him warily, and then stared out the window. "I was also thinking about—" She hesitated. "Miles." Fenton cringed at the name. He looked down at his empty hands and remembered when they'd held his stillborn baby boy. He shook himself deliberately.
"Amelia, I asked you never to mention that name to me again,"
he growled quietly, and marched over to the window to draw her away. He didn't want her to be seen in her present attire. When he reached for her arm, Fenton immediately noticed what had drawn her attention. The view from their room showed the neighbors' stables, and there, sitting on a wooden fence, was a young boy of about 6, with dark, curly brown hair. He was swinging his legs back and forth while singing a song and petting a large stallion. It was instantly obvious to Fenton what had triggered his wife's thoughts of their deceased child. Miles would have been around that age, and probably very similar in his appearance. Just then, a woman, wearing an apron, likely the boy's mother, stomped outside. Hands on her hips, her eyebrows furrowed, she vehemently scolded the boy for his disobeying her orders to stay away from the stables. Carelessly, she seized his arm and dragged him from atop the fence. Spanking his bottom firmly, she instructed him to run along and get his chores done, or else. The woman visibly rolled her eyes as the young lad ran off to do as she'd told him. She turned to go back into her house, and then glanced backward at the very window Amelia and Fenton were watching from. Noticing them there, she greeted them with a friendly wave and a smile. Shrugging her shoulders, she laughed, as if the entire scene were quite commonplace, and therefore humorous. Fenton inclined his head in acknowledgment of her greeting, and then the woman went back into her house. "Maxwell has interesting neighbors," he mused. There was a long pause. "Amelia, my dear, I thought it might be a good idea for you to go and visit your brother today. What do you think?" Fenton asked, refusing to give further thought to the little boy. Amelia finished her orange juice and left the vicinity of the window. "Whatever you think is best, Fenton." "Aren't you excited? You haven't seen your brother in years." "It has only been so long, because of you," she stated blatantly. "I have no doubt it was your—" She paused deliberately and gave him a sly look. "Well, devious ways that drove him away from me, and now we have the reverse. Your mischievous intentions have brought us together again." Fenton put his hand in his pocket and watched her very, very, very carefully. "I just don't know. These circumstances, they're very mysterious. What exactly is it that your brother wants with my brother?" "Nothing." "Nothing?" "Maxwell doesn't care about your brother. That much." "Ah, then it is his wife." Fenton nodded. "He is quite besotted." "Do you honestly expect me to be a part of a plot to deprive my brother of his wife?" "Not only do I expect it, I demand it," Fenton said calmly, but the flash of his eyes sent tremors up her spine. Over the years, she had seen what he was capable of. "And if I refuse?" Fenton sighed. "Then I can do nothing." She lifted an eyebrow and waited, knowing he was far from finished. "To stop Maxwell from disposing of Mr. Reign. You see, my most illustrious wife, Maxwell has already attempted to murder your brother, and he will not hesitate, given another opportunity, if that is the only avenue he sees. If you really love your brother, you'll do everything in your power to separate him from Elizabeth Dalton." Amelia, who had been standing close to the fireplace, now tapped a finger deliberately on the mantel. "I do not think I'll go and see my brother today, Fenton." She stifled his imminent complaint by announcing, "I will go tomorrow after breakfast. Today I wish to be a tourist, and do just what tourists do, and take a look around your brother's town." Fenton's lips curved into a victorious grin. "Very good, dearest. I knew you would come to see the circumstances just as I do. I shall call our footman to assist you with your plans for today." His wife deftly slipped into his lap before he had a chance to rise and do what he intended. "Perhaps before you go—" Her lips found his, and he soon discovered she had other plans before fulfilling her role as a vacationer. Elizabeth awoke to the rooster's crow, immediately noticing that Paxton was nowhere to be seen. Quickly she washed, threw on some clothes, and went to the kitchen. The jar of cocoa was exactly where she'd left it, and beckoned to her from the large oak table. Elizabeth glanced through the window, immediately ascertaining why there was so little light in the room. There was a thick fog hanging ominously in the air, disabling the daylight and blocking her view of the corral. The gloomy weather didn't help to hush the uneasy feeling that was constantly present in recent days. She felt her stomach growl and decided she could wait just a little longer to investigate the jar. Breakfast seemed more important at this point. She lit a fire in the stove and prepared some leftover porridge. Elizabeth was fully aware she was partially afraid to open the cocoa. As things were now, she didn't know what it held, whether it held news of her father, or incriminating evidence against Stanton, or anything else. Although the unknowing was torturous, it was also nurturing what remaining hope she had. Once that container was opened, all mystery would be removed, and there was the possibility she'd be disappointed by what was revealed, and her hopes shattered. That glass jar could hold absolutely nothing but cocoa, as Fenton Stanton had supposed. Patting her fingertip on the lid of the jar, she slowly pulled the container closer. She sat up abruptly when a minuscule mound of what could only be cocoa powder built up along the bottom edge of the jar. Her mind raced to figure out how the cocoa had escaped. She hadn't opened it, at least to her memory. Perhaps one of the men had come in and helped himself. That was doubtful, since the men were very respectful of the Reigns' privacy and only entered the house when invited. It was possible some had spilt when she first dumped it out onto the table, with all the other contents of her bag. "Lizzie!" It was Paxton calling her from outside. "Yes?" She stood up and went over to the window. A sudden shiver of appreciation coursed through her when she saw her husband waiting for her just a foot away from the sill. His hair was tousled, and a substantial layer of dirt was caked onto his boots and pant cuffs. His chin and cheeks were covered with stubble, and the entirety of his face was smeared with dust. Yet, with all of this, he still appeared to her to be the most attractive man she'd ever laid eyes on. He came up to her, and she leaned out of the sill and kissed him. When she'd stopped kissing her husband, her nose crinkled and her brow furrowed. She had to resist the temptation to wave her hand under her nose. Paxton smiled sheepishly. The boys and I had a real tough time mucking out the stalls after the storm. Sorry.
Pax, why'd you let me sleep in so late? You and the boys are probably famished and ready for lunch, and I just barely finished breakfast.
I wanted you to get as much rest as you needed. Did you sleep well?
She shrugged and changed the subject. I'll get lunch on. Tell the boys 15 minutes.
He nodded. Thanks, sweetheart.
She blew him a kiss and went back into the kitchen. The jar of star cocoa sat more ostentatiously than ever, and she was sorely tempted to simply grab it and open it. Just then she heard the noises of hungry men approaching the house, and remembered she'd promised to have lunch ready in 15 minutes. Seizing the cocoa, she stashed it, almost resentfully, into a cupboard, and started preparing lunch.